November 14, 1942. El Alamein, Egyptian desert. British 8th Army Forward Maintenance Depot. The Sherman's track snapped at 127 degrees Fahrenheit, and 3 men burned alive before Bill Hackett could reach the fire extinguisher. He still heard their screaming in his sleep. Not the high-pitched wails you'd expect, but something lower, more animal. A sound that bypassed the brain and went straight into the spine. That was 4 days ago. The desert sand had already covered the scorch marks where Tank Commander Lieutenant James Morrison and his crew had tried to escape their burning metal coffin. The wind erased everything here eventually. Men, mistakes, memory. But Bill Hackett remembered. Now, standing in the suffocating heat of the Forward Maintenance Depot, Staff Sergeant William Hackett stared at another Sherman, M4A1, serial number 3031584, and saw the same death sentence written in its track assembly. The rubber bogie wheels were cracking. The steel pins were grinding themselves into oblivion. The track links were loose enough to hear them rattle over the constant hammer and wrench symphony of 20 mechanics, trying to keep Montgomery's armor advance from grinding to a halt. The heat was biblical. It pressed down on the corrugated tin roof like the hand of an angry god, turning the maintenance shed into a furnace that made men hallucinate and metal expand beyond its tolerances. Bill's khaki uniform was stained white with salt rings from evaporated sweat. His hands were black with grease that never truly washed away. His eyes were red-rimmed from sand and sleep deprivation. He was 34 years old. A lifetime ago, he'd been a garage mechanic in Leeds, fixing Morris 8s and Austin 7s for housewives and shopkeepers. He'd had clean fingernails then. A wife named Sarah. A daughter named Emma who'd just turned 7 when he enlisted. That world felt like a fever dream now. "Sergeant Hackett!" The voice cut through the metallic din like a knife. "General Montgomery wants a status report on the Sherman deployables. How many tanks can roll Bio 600 tomorrow?" Major Edmund Winters stood in the shed entrance, silhouetted against the blinding white light of the desert noon. He was fresh from Cairo, pressed uniform, polished boots, skin that hadn't yet been scoured raw by sand and sun. Staff officers always looked like that, clean, certain, untouched by the mathematics of mechanical failure and human mortality. Bill didn't look up from the track assembly. 42 operational, sir. Maybe 45 if we can source replacement bogie wheels from the depot at Alexandria. Montgomery needs 60 by dawn. The Africa Corps is regrouping at Mersa Matruh. We need to maintain pressure. Then Montgomery needs to talk to God, sir, because I can't make steel and rubber materialize out of sand. The other mechanics had stopped working. The shed fell silent except for the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and the low moan of wind through gaps in the tin walls. You didn't speak to staff officers that way. Not unless you were ready for court-martial or worse. Major Winters stepped into the shed. His boots crunched on the sand-covered concrete floor. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. 3 days ago, Lieutenant Morrison's tank threw a track during a pursuit operation. The tank stopped. The crew couldn't evacuate before a German 88 put a shell through the turret. Morrison was 23 years old. His gunner was 19. His driver had a baby girl he'd never met. Winters paused. "I signed the letters to their families this morning. Would you like to tell me again what you can't do, Sergeant?" Bill finally looked up. His eyes met the Major's, and for a moment something passed between them. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of exhausted understanding that came from being too close to death for too long. "Morrison's track didn't fail because of combat stress, sir." Bill's voice was flat, factual. "It failed because standard-issue track grease liquefies at 115 degrees. We've been operating at 125 plus for 6 weeks. The grease turns to soup, runs off the pins, and the tracks grind themselves apart. Then the tank stops. Then men die." He gestured at the shed full of wounded Shermans. "Every single one of these failures is the same. It's not the tanks, it's the damn grease." Winters stared at him for a long moment. Around them, the mechanics had returned to work, but Bill could feel them listening. Everyone knew about the grease problem. Everyone had watched good tanks become death traps because some procurement officer in London had approved lubricant designed for the rain-soaked fields of Europe, not the inferno of North Africa. "What do you need?" Winters asked finally. "Time, resources, and permission to stop following the manual." "Explain." Bill pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped his hands, a futile gesture that did nothing but smear the grease around. He'd been thinking about this problem for weeks, ever since Morrison's crew burned. Thinking about it while other men slept. Thinking about it while he ate his rations of bully beef and hard biscuit. Thinking about it while he tried to write letters home to Sarah that didn't sound like goodbye. The grease fails because it's petroleum-based with a low flash point. In this heat, it breaks down chemically. What we need is something with a higher temperature tolerance. Something that stays viscous even when the metal is hot enough to fry an egg. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been experimenting, sir. Mixing different compounds, trying to create something that might work." Experimenting. Winter's tone was unreadable. "With what?" "Axle grease from the supply trucks. Graphite powder from electrical brushes. Some industrial lubricant I requisitioned from the railroad depot in Alexandria. And..." Bill hesitated. This was the part that would either get him a commendation or a court-martial. Aircraft hydraulic fluid. The stuff they use in the Spitfire landing gear assemblies. The silence that followed was absolute. "You've been mixing random compounds," Winters said slowly, "and applying them to His Majesty's armored vehicles." "Yes, sir." "Without authorization." "Yes, sir." "That's technically sabotage, Sergeant Hackett." "Yes, sir, it is." Major Winters walked to the nearest Sherman and placed his palm flat against the track assembly. The metal was hot enough to brand skin. He held his hand there for a 3 count, then pulled it away and examined the red mark blooming across his palm. "Show me," he said. Bill led him to the back of the maintenance shed, where a single Sherman sat isolated from the others. Tank M4A1. Serial number 3031547. It looked identical to every other Sherman in the depot. 30 tons of riveted steel, a 75mm main gun, and a profile that German tankers had nicknamed the Ronson because it lit up like the cigarette lighter. One shot, one fire. But this Sherman was different. "I've been testing the mixture on this one for 3 weeks, Bill explained, running his hand along the track assembly. 200 miles of operation in temperatures ranging from 110 to 132 degrees. The tracks have shown minimal wear. No pin failures, no rubber degradation. The crew reports smoother operation and reduced mechanical noise." Winters crouched beside the track, studying it with the intensity of a man whose decisions sent other men to die. "What's in this mixture exactly?" Bill pulled a dented metal tin from a nearby workbench. Inside was a thick, dark substance that looked like tar mixed with coal dust. 60% heavy axle grease. The stuff meant for 5-ton trucks. 20% aircraft hydraulic fluid for temperature stability. 15% graphite powder for reduced friction. 5% engine oil to keep it from solidifying completely. He replaced the lid. "The proportions took me 47 tries to get right. The first batch caught fire. The 12th batch turned solid. The 23rd ate through rubber like acid. And you've been applying this experimental compound to operational tanks." "Just this one, sir. I wanted to be sure before 3 more men burned to death." Winters stood, his face unreadable in the shadows of the shed. "You're either the bravest mechanic in the 8th Army or the most idiotic. I haven't decided which." Permission to speak freely, sir? You've been speaking freely for the past 10 minutes, Sergeant. Don't stop now. Morrison didn't have to die. Neither did his crew. They died because someone in London thought the same grease that works in Sussex would work in the Sahara. They died because nobody questioned the manual. Nobody tried to solve the problem. Bill's voice had risen despite himself. I'm just a mechanic from Leeds, sir. I fix things. And right now the thing that needs fixing is killing our men faster than the Germans are. The wind outside had picked up, hurling sand against the tin walls in a sound like distant applause. Somewhere in the depot, someone was singing, a melancholy Irish ballad that drifted through the heat-shimmer afternoon. The war went on. The desert went on. Men kept dying because machines kept failing. Major Winters pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it with a battered Zippo, and took a long drag. The smoke curled up into the superheated air and vanished. Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant Hackett. You're going to show me exactly how to make this idiotic grease mixture of yours. Then you're going to supervise its application to every operational Sherman in this depot. If it works, you'll be decorated. If it fails, you'll be court-martialed. He exhaled smoke. Either way, by 0600 tomorrow, Montgomery gets his 60 tanks. Yes, sir. And Sergeant? Winters turned to leave, then paused. Morrison's daughter, the one he never met. Her name is Elizabeth. She was born on September 3rd in a hospital in Manchester. In case you needed another reason to get this right. Then he was gone, back into the white furnace of the afternoon, leaving Bill alone with a shed full of broken tanks and a tin of experimental grease that might save lives or end his career. He looked at his hands, black with grease, scarred from 1,000 sharp edges, trembling slightly from exhaustion and something that might have been fear. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Not a storm. There were no storms in November in the Egyptian desert. Artillery. The war was 15 miles west and closing. Rommel's army was wounded but not dead. There would be more fighting, more burning tanks, more men screaming inside steel coffins. Bill Hackett picked up the tin of grease and went to work. The desert had no mercy for machinery. But maybe, just maybe, a mechanic from Leeds could change the mathematics of survival. Maybe. The work began after sunset, when the desert temperature dropped from unbearable to merely brutal. Bill Hackett stood before 60 mechanics in the main assembly area, illuminated by the harsh glare of portable flood lamps powered by sputtering generators. The lights carved deep shadows across exhausted faces, men who'd already worked 16-hour shifts and now faced an all-night operation to save Montgomery's armor advance. Behind him, 42 Sherman tanks sat in neat rows like wounded soldiers awaiting surgery. The smell of diesel fuel, hot metal, and sweat hung in the air like a physical presence. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the flood lamps, jackals yipped and howled, their voices carrying across the empty desert with eerie clarity. Bill held up the dented metal tin containing his experimental grease mixture. His hands were steadier than he felt. "Gentlemen," he began, his Leeds accent thick with fatigue. "What I'm about to ask you to do is either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. Major Winters has given us authorization to apply an untested compound to every operational tank in this depot. If it works, we might save lives. If it fails..." He paused, meeting the eyes of men he'd worked beside for months. "If it fails, we'll probably all be scrubbing latrines in Cairo until the war ends." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the assembly. Corporal Davies, a Welsh coal miner's son with hands like shovels, called out, "What's in this miracle grease then, Sarge?" "Nothing you'd find in the manual," Bill replied. "Truck axle grease, aircraft hydraulic fluid, graphite powder, and engine oil. Mixed in proportions that took me 7 weeks to figure out." He set the tin down on a workbench. "The official designation from Major Winters is Experimental Compound 14 November. but the men who've been helping me test it have another name." "What's that?" someone asked. "Hackett's Idiotic Mix." This time the laughter was genuine. The dark, fatalistic humor of men who'd seen too much death to take anything too seriously. "Right then," Bill continued, pulling out a grease-stained notebook, "here's how this works. We're dividing into 12 teams of 5. Each team takes 3 to 4 tanks. You'll need to completely strip the old grease from every track pin, every bogie wheel bearing, every suspension point. Then we apply the new compound. Thick, but not so thick it impedes movement. The whole process takes about 90 minutes per tank, if you know what you're doing." Private Henderson, a former Oxford engineering student, raised his hand. "Sergeant, what if the mixture reacts badly with residual petroleum from the old grease? Chemical incompatibility could cause catastrophic failure." "Yes." Bill nodded. "Which is why we're cleaning everything down to bare metal first. Use the solvent drums behind Shop 3. Strip it clean, dry it completely, then apply the new compound. No shortcuts, no rushing. If you're not sure, ask me or one of the crew chiefs." He surveyed the assembly. Some faces showed exhaustion. Others showed skepticism. A few showed something that might have been hope. "I know you're tired," Bill said quietly. "I know you want to sleep. I know some of you think this is madness." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. 3 days ago, Lieutenant Morrison and his crew burned to death because a track failed at the worst possible moment. Before him, it was Sergeant Wilkins. Before him, Corporal McLeod. Before him, his voice caught slightly. "Too many good men have died because we kept following a manual written by people who've never felt a 130-degree heat." The assembly had gone completely silent. Even the generators seemed to quiet. "Tonight, we stop following that manual. Tonight, we try something different. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a Sherman crew rolls into combat, they won't have to worry about their track failing before the enemy even fires a shot." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Corporal Davies stood, picked up a solvent bucket, and headed toward the nearest Sherman. "Well," he called over his shoulder, "are we doing this or not?" The assembly broke like a wave. Men grabbed tools, solvent drums, work lamps. The night filled with the clang of equipment and the low rumble of voices organizing into teams. Bill watched them disperse, feeling something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, but a kind of grim determination that felt like purpose. Major Winters emerged from the shadows at the edge of the flood lamps. "Quite the speech, Sergeant." "Just telling them the truth, sir. The truth." Winters lit another cigarette, the flame from his Zippo briefly illuminating his face. "The truth is we're gambling 60 tanks, and God knows how many lives on a mixture invented by a garage mechanic from Leeds. You understand that if this fails, it won't just be your career that ends?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Winters exhaled smoke into the desert night. "Then you also understand that if it succeeds, you'll have done something no procurement officer, no staff engineer, and no general has managed to do. You'll have solved a problem that's been killing our tank crews since we landed in North Africa." Bill didn't respond. What was there to say? They stood together in silence, watching the mechanics swarm over the Shermans like ants over sugar. The work had a rhythm to it. The rasp of wire brushes stripping old grease, the splash of solvent in metal pans, the careful methodical application of the new compound with brushes and rags. Flood lamps cast stark shadows that made the tanks look larger, more imposing, like sleeping iron giants awaiting awakening. "Tell me something, Hackett," Winters said after a while. "What made you think you could solve this? You're not an engineer. You don't have a university degree. You fix cars for housewives." "Fixed, sir. Past tense." Bill wiped his hands on his already filthy rag. "And I thought I could solve it because nobody else was trying. Everyone just accepted it as the cost of desert warfare. But I kept thinking—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "I kept thinking about my daughter, Emma. She's 8 now. When I left England, I promised her I'd come home. And every time I watched a tank crew burn because of a mechanical failure, I thought, what if that was me? What if Emma never saw her father again because someone in London couldn't be bothered to question a grease specification? So this is personal. Everything's personal in war, sir. We just pretend it isn't." A sudden commotion erupted near Tank 30-31592. Bill's head snapped toward the sound, shouting, the clatter of dropped tools. He was running before his conscious mind registered the movement. Major Winters close behind. They found Private Chen, a Canadian volunteer with steady hands and a mechanic's instincts, kneeling beside the Sherman's left track assembly, his face pale in the work lamp's glare. "What happened?" Bill demanded. Chen held up his hands. They were covered in a dark, viscous substance that definitely wasn't the new grease compound. "The old lubricant, Sarge. It's not coming off. It's like it's fused to the metal." Bill crouched beside him, examining the track pin. Chen was right. The petroleum-based grease had been baked onto the steel by weeks of extreme heat, creating a layer that resisted solvent and scrubbing. If they couldn't remove it completely, the new compound might not adhere properly. Or worse, it might react chemically with the residue. "Henderson," Bill called. "Get over here." The Oxford student arrived within seconds, assessed the situation, and frowned. The heat has caused molecular bonding between the lubricant and the metal oxidation layer. Standard solvents won't penetrate it. In English, Private, "The grease is cooked onto the metal, Sergeant. We need something more aggressive." Bill's mind raced through possibilities. Battery acid? Too dangerous? Lye? They didn't have enough. Abrading it off with grinding wheels? Too time-consuming, and they'd risk damaging the metal. Then he remembered something from his days in the garage, a trick an old-timer had shown him for removing stubborn carbon deposits from engine blocks. "Fire," he said quietly. Everyone stared at him. "We heat the metal with blowtorches until the grease liquefies and burns off. Then we quench it with solvent while it's still hot. The thermal shock should break down any remaining residue." "That's insane," Henderson said. "The heat could warp the metal, change its temper, weaken the structural integrity. It's also our only option that doesn't involve spending 12 hours per tank with grinding wheels we don't have." Bill stood, making the decision. "We tested on one pin assembly. If it works, we proceed. If it doesn't—" He met Major Winters' eyes. "Then I was wrong, and we go back to the manual." Winters studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Do it." The next 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Bill personally handled the blowtorch, playing the blue flame across the stubborn grease deposit with the focused intensity of a surgeon making a critical incision. The grease liquefied, smoking and bubbling, filling the air with an acrid stench that made men cough and retreat. When the metal glowed dull red, he killed the flame and immediately doused the assembly with solvent. The effect was dramatic. The grease residue cracked and flaked away like old paint, leaving clean steel beneath. Henderson checked the metal with calipers and a hardness tester borrowed from the motor pool. No measurable deformation, hardness within acceptable parameters. He looked up, surprise evident on his young face. It worked. Bill didn't allow himself to feel relief. Not yet. "Right. Pass the word to all teams. Stubborn deposits get the torch treatment. Carefully. Any fool who warps a track pin answers to me personally." He turned to Major Winters. "This is going to add time, sir. We might not make the 0600 deadline. Then we work faster." Winters raised his voice, addressing the entire assembly area. "Listen up. New procedure for old grease removal. Watch Sergeant Hackett's demonstration, then replicate on your assigned tanks. Questions go through your team leaders. And remember, we're not just fixing tanks tonight. We're buying time for every crew that rolls out of this depot. Make it count. The work resumed with renewed urgency. Bill moved from team to team, demonstrating the torch technique, checking applications of the new compound, answering questions, solving problems. The night blurred into a succession of mechanical challenges and improvised solutions. A seized bogie wheel that required a 20-ton hydraulic jack. A cracked suspension arm that needed welding. A track pin that had worn so thin it needed complete replacement. Through it all, the pile of empty grease tins grew. Hackett's Idiotic mix applied one careful brush stroke at a time to 60 tanks that would carry British and Commonwealth crews into battle against Rommel's battered but still dangerous Afrika Korps. At 3:47 hours, Private Chen approached Bill with a smoke-blackened face and a question that had been bothering him. "Sarge, what if it doesn't work? What if we've just wasted an entire night and the tracks still fail?" Bill paused in his work, set down his brush, and looked at the young Canadian. Chen was 19, maybe 20, young enough to believe that asking the right questions could prevent disaster. "Then we'll have failed trying something new instead of succeeding at nothing," Bill said quietly. "And sometimes that's all you can do." Chen considered this, then nodded and returned to his team. Bill watched him go, then looked at his hands again. Still black with grease. Still trembling slightly with exhaustion. Still doing the only thing he knew how to do: fix things that were broken. Behind him, a Sherman's engine coughed to life, a deep, rumbling roar that cut through the night. Then another. Then another. The maintenance depot filled with the thunder of 30-ton machines awakening, their newly greased tracks gleaming dully in the flood lamplight. Major Winters appeared at Bill's elbow. 58 operational, he said. 2 still need minor repairs. We'll have them ready within the hour. 60 tanks by dawn, Bill murmured. Just like Montgomery wanted. Just like Montgomery wanted. Winters dropped his cigarette and ground it out with his boot heel. Now comes the hard part. What's that, sir? Waiting to see if your idiotic mixture actually works. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but that pale pre-dawn glow that promised the return of punishing heat. In a few hours, these Shermans would roll west toward the retreating Afrika Korps. They'd traverse rock and sand and broken ground at speeds that would test every mechanical system to its limits. And Bill Hackett's experimental grease compound would either justify his gamble or condemn it. He thought of Emma, of Sarah, of Lieutenant Morrison burning in his tank, of all the mechanics who'd ever been told, "That's how it's always been done," when they suggested a better way. "Permission to accompany the tank column, sir?" Bill heard himself say. "I should be there. If there are problems I can—" "Absolutely not." Winters cut him off. "You're too valuable to risk in combat. If this works, we'll need you here training other mechanics in your technique." He paused. "And if it fails, we'll need you here to face the consequences." "Fair enough." The last Sherman rumbled to life. Somewhere in the depot, someone was singing again. That same Irish ballad from earlier, but in a different voice. The song was spreading, Bill realized. Passing from man to man like a virus or a prayer. "The water is wide, I cannot cross o'er, and neither have I wings to fly." Bill closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The desert had no mercy for machinery. But tonight, a mechanic from Leeds had tried to change the equation. Morning would tell if mercy could be engineered. Bill Hackett wasn't supposed to be there. He clung to the rear deck of Sherman M4A1, serial number 3031547. His test tank, the one he'd nursed through 3 weeks of experimental trials, as the column of 60 tanks thundered westward across the hardpan desert. Major Winters had explicitly ordered him to remain at the depot. Bill had nodded, saluted, and then climbed aboard the moment Winters turned his back. Some things you had to see for yourself. The morning sun was already vicious, climbing toward another day of 120-degree heat. The horizon shimmered with mirage lakes that promised water, but delivered only more sand and stone. Around him, the British 8th Army's armor advance stretched across the desert like a mechanical herd. Shermans, Crusaders, and Grant tanks, accompanied by supply trucks, fuel tankers, and the inevitable swarm of motorcycle dispatch riders weaving between the columns. The noise was overwhelming. 60 diesel engines roaring in concert. The rattle and clank of track links eating distance. The occasional backfire or mechanical complaint from machines pushed to their operational limits. Inside his tank, Commander Lieutenant Robert Hayes and his crew were probably shouting to be heard over the din. Out here on the rear deck, Bill could barely hear himself think. Which was fine. Thinking led to worrying, and worrying led to imagining all the ways his idiotic grease mixture could fail catastrophically. He'd brought tools, a small kit strapped to his back containing wrenches, grease gun, spare pins, and another tin of his experimental compound. If something went wrong, he wanted to be able to fix it immediately, or at least understand what had killed them. The tank lurched over a rocky outcrop. Bill grabbed the turret grab handle to steady himself, his knuckles white with tension. Through the dust cloud kicked up by 42 tons of rolling steel, he could see the other Shermans maintaining formation, a company strength element pushing toward the retreating Africa Corps, with orders to harass, delay, and prevent Rommel from establishing a defensive line. 3 miles out, the first test came. The ground changed from hardpan to soft sand, the kind of terrain that ate tracks like acid. Bill felt the Sherman's rhythm change as Lieutenant Hayes downshifted, the engine note deepening as the driver fought to maintain momentum. Around them, other tanks began to slow, their tracks churning sand in rooster tails of dust. This was where Morrison's tank had failed, where the heat and sand and mechanical stress had turned lubricant to useless liquid and track pins to grinding metal on metal. Bill's hand unconsciously reached for the toolkit on his back. The Sherman lurched again, harder this time. For one heart-stopping moment, Bill thought he felt the distinctive shudder that preceded track failure. That specific vibration that every mechanic learned to recognize and dread. But the moment passed. The tank continued forward, tracks biting into sand with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. No grinding, no slippage, no catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. Bill let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The radio crackled inside the tank, muffled by steel but audible enough that Bill caught fragments of the transmission. Contact bearing 270, German armor, estimated 3 Panthers and supporting infantry. The column began to maneuver. Tanks that had been rolling in loose formation suddenly tightened up, turrets traversing to scan the western horizon. Bill felt his Sherman accelerate, the engine note climbing as Hayes pushed for speed. This was what they'd come for. Not just to test grease compounds, but to engage the enemy. To push Rommel's battered forces farther west, farther from the vital supply lines running through Egypt. Bill should have felt fear, should have been terrified of being caught on the outside of a tank during combat. But all he felt was a strange, detached curiosity about whether his mechanical solution would hold up under the ultimate test, battle conditions at maximum operational stress. The first shell screamed overhead before anyone saw the German positions. It was a sound Bill would never forget. Not a whistle like in the movies, but a tearing, ripping noise like the sky itself being shredded. The shell impacted 200 yards to the left, throwing up a geyser of sand and rock that rained down across multiple tanks. The column scattered into combat formation with practiced efficiency. Shermans peeled left and right, spreading out to present multiple targets while closing the distance to effective firing range. The 75mm guns began to bark, sharp, ear-splitting cracks that made Bill's teeth ache. Through the chaos of dust and noise, he caught glimpses of the German position. 3 Panthers, just as the radio had reported, hull down behind a rocky ridge with their long 75mm guns already engaging. Supporting them were what looked like a platoon of Panzer Grenadiers, with an 88mm anti-tank gun being hastily repositioned. The mathematics of tank combat were brutally simple. The Panther's gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges where the Sherman's gun could barely scratch the Panther's frontal plate. The only advantages the British had were numbers and maneuverability. And reliable tracks. Bill's Sherman lurched hard to the right as Hayes evaded incoming fire. The tracks held. No slippage. No breakage. The experimental grease was doing its job, keeping the suspension points lubricated even as the metal heated to temperatures that would have liquefied standard-issue lubricant. Another shell screamed past, closer this time. Close enough that Bill felt the shockwave like a physical blow. He pressed himself flat against the rear deck, suddenly very aware that he was completely exposed and thoroughly helpless. This was insane. He was a mechanic, not a combat soldier. He fixed things, he didn't shoot at them. But he stayed. Because if the tracks failed now, he needed to know. Needed to see it happen. Needed to understand what he'd done wrong so he could fix it for the next crew, the next tank, the next battle. The Sherman's gun fired. The recoil rocked the entire tank, and through the acrid smoke, Bill saw a Panzer Grenadier position erupt in flame. Lieutenant Hayes was good, precise, controlled, methodical. The kind of tank commander who would have survived Morrison's mission if his tracks hadn't betrayed him. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. In that time, Bill watched 2 Shermans take hits, one penetrating shot that killed the tank but allowed the crew to evacuate, another that glanced off the turret and did nothing but scar the armor. He watched British tank crews maneuver with courage that bordered on recklessness, closing the distance to the German position despite the Panther's superior range, and he watched his experimental grease compound perform exactly as intended. Through sand and heat and violent maneuvering, through emergency stops and sharp turns and maximum acceleration, through everything that should have caused track failure, the Sherman's drivetrain held together. Not just his test tank, but all of them. 60 tanks that should have been losing tracks left and right, but instead maintained cohesion and combat effectiveness. When the German position finally broke, the Panthers withdrawing westward and the 88mm crew abandoning their gun, Bill felt something crack inside his chest. Not relief exactly, but a kind of exhausted vindication. It had worked. His idiotic mixture had actually worked. The column stopped to refuel and rearm at a hastily established forward supply point. The afternoon heat was at its peak, 132 degrees according to someone's thermometer, and the metal surfaces of the tanks were hot enough to raise blisters. Bill climbed down from the Sherman on legs that trembled with fatigue and adrenaline crash. He'd been clinging to that rear deck for nearly 9 hours, through 1 engagement and 200 miles of brutal desert terrain. Lieutenant Hayes emerged from the tank's commander hatch, his face blackened with powder smoke and creased with exhaustion. He was 26 years old, Bill knew. A school teacher from Cornwall before the war. Married. No children yet, though his wife was pregnant. "You're Hackett," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "The mechanic who invented the new grease compound." "Yes, sir." Hayes studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "My crew and I are alive because of you. Morrison's crew would be too, if you'd solved this problem 3 days earlier." He paused. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate, but it's all I have." Bill shook his hand, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. Around them, other tank crews were dismounting, checking their vehicles, sharing cigarettes and water and stories of the engagement. Bill moved through the crowd in a daze, examining track assemblies, checking for wear patterns, documenting what he found in his grease-stained notebook. The results were beyond his most optimistic projections. Minimal wear on track pins, bogie wheels still properly lubricated. No signs of the heat-induced degradation that had plagued the standard grease. If anything, the compound seemed to have performed better under combat stress than in his controlled tests. He was crouched beside Tank 3031592, Private Chen's assignment, when Major Winters found him. "Sergeant Hackett." Winters' voice was carefully neutral. "You were ordered to remain at the depot." "Yes, sir." "Instead, you stowed away on a combat mission without authorization, without proper equipment, and without regard for your own safety." "Yes, sir." "That's insubordination. Possibly desertion of post. Certainly grounds for court-martial." Winters paused. "It's also the bravest damn fool thing I've seen in 6 months of desert warfare." Bill looked up, meeting the Major's eyes. "The tracks held, sir. All of them. 200 miles, 1 engagement, temperatures exceeding 130 degrees, and not a single track failure. The compound works." "I know." Winters pulled out his cigarette case, offered one to Bill. "I've been receiving radio reports from company commanders all day. They're calling your mixture magic grease. Why, one captain swears it saved his entire platoon during a German ambush near Sidi Barrani." They smoked in silence for a moment, watching the sun descend toward the western horizon. The quality of light was changing, softening, turning the desert gold and amber and rust. "What happens now, sir?" Bill asked finally. "Now?" Winters exhaled smoke. "Now we document everything. Composition, application procedure, performance data. Then we transmit it to 8th Army Headquarters, who'll pass it to the War Office, who'll probably assign some engineer with 3 university degrees to verify what a garage mechanic from Leeds figured out with trial and error. And then your idiotic mixture becomes standard issue for all armor operations in North Africa, possibly the entire Mediterranean theater. We'll need to establish production facilities, train mechanics, develop quality control procedures." He looked at Bill. "Which means I'm recommending you for promotion to warrant officer and assignment as Chief Technical Advisor for tank maintenance operations." Bill stared at him. "Sir, I'm just a mechanic. I don't know anything about—" "You know how to solve problems that no one else could solve. You know how to question assumptions and think creatively under pressure. And most importantly, you know that following the manual isn't always enough." Winters dropped his cigarette and ground it out. "That's worth more than a dozen university degrees." Around them, the refueling operation continued. Tank crews laughing and joking with the gallows humor of men who'd survived another day. Mechanics checking systems, tightening bolts, preparing for tomorrow's advance. The war went on. But something had shifted. Some small mechanical problem had been solved by a stubborn man who refused to accept that good soldiers should die because of inadequate lubricant. "There's something else," Winters said quietly. "Lieutenant Morrison's wife, his widow now. She wrote to me, asked how her husband died, what his last moments were like." He pulled a folded letter from his pocket. "I wrote back, told her the truth about the track failure, told her that a mechanic in the depot had been working on a solution, told her that her husband's death wasn't meaningless, that it inspired someone to fix the problem so other families wouldn't suffer the same loss." He handed the letter to Bill. "She asked me to thank you. Said that James, Lieutenant Morrison, would have appreciated knowing that his death led to something that might save lives." Bill unfolded the letter with hands that suddenly wouldn't stay steady. The handwriting was precise, controlled. The words of someone fighting to maintain composure while her world collapsed. "Please tell Sergeant Hackett that James believed good men should spend their lives solving problems, not causing them. He would be honored to know that his sacrifice contributed to saving other tank crews. Tell him that Elizabeth, our daughter, will grow up knowing her father's death had meaning." Bill couldn't finish reading. The words blurred, swimming in moisture he refused to acknowledge as tears. He thought of Emma, of Sarah, of all the daughters and wives and mothers who waited for men who might never come home, of Lieutenant Morrison burning in his tank because someone in London couldn't be bothered to test grease compounds in desert conditions. "I want to write to her," Bill heard himself say. "To Morrison's widow. Would that be appropriate, sir? I think she'd like that very much." The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. In a few hours, darkness would fall. The tanks would roll again. The war would continue its grinding advance across North Africa, through Sicily, up the spine of Italy, eventually to the beaches of Normandy and beyond. But tonight, in this moment, a mechanic from Leeds had changed one small piece of that vast machinery, had solved one problem out of thousands, had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to something as mundane as inadequate lubricant. It wasn't much. It wouldn't end the war. It wouldn't bring back the men already lost. But it was something. Bill Hackett pulled out his notebook and began to write, documenting the day's performance data with the meticulous precision of a man who understood that details mattered, that small things could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Around him, mechanics continued their work. Tanks rumbled and coughed to life. The desert prepared for another night of cold after the day's brutal heat. And somewhere in the darkness, jackals howled their ancient songs to the indifferent stars. The War Office officially adopted Hackett's compound, no longer Idiotic, in February 1943. Production facilities were established in Alexandria, Cairo, and Tripoli. By the time of the Sicily invasion in July, every Allied tank in the Mediterranean theater used the modified grease mixture. Warrant Officer William Hackett survived the war. He returned to Leeds in September 1945, reunited with Sarah and Emma, and reopened his garage. He never spoke much about North Africa, except to say that he'd been a mechanic who'd fixed some tanks. He died in 1987, age 79, surrounded by family. His obituary in the Yorkshire Post mentioned his military service in a single sentence. It made no reference to the experimental grease compound that had extended Sherman tank track life by an average of 500 miles in desert conditions, or to the estimated 1,200 lives saved because tracks no longer failed at critical moments. But in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, buried among thousands of technical reports and maintenance logs, there's a memo dated November 16, 1942. Experimental compound 14 November, commonly known as Hackett's Mix, has proven extraordinarily effective under combat conditions. Recommend immediate adoption and commendation for S. Sergeant William Hackett for initiative and technical innovation under fire. His solution to the desert track lubrication problem represents the kind of creative problem-solving that wins wars, not through grand strategy, but through the accumulation of small victories over mechanical adversity. It was signed by Major Edmund Winters, who himself survived the war and became a professor of military history at Cambridge. The memo ends with a handwritten postscript. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with grease guns. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never fire a shot. The desert had no mercy for machinery. But one stubborn mechanic had refused to accept that as the final word. And that had made all the difference.